so it doesn't chime.
Perfect. Well, good morning. It is Monday, April 27th, and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj. I'm Managing Director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm in Washington. We are beginning week 7 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The White House Corona Task Force Coordinator, Dr. Deborah Birx, noted on Sunday that social distancing would likely remain in place through the summer as some states look to ease limits. Today's topic is addressing America's food crisis during the coronavirus. And our very special guest is Billy Shore, the founder and executive chairman of Share Our Strength. Welcome. Good to see you, Billy.
Thanks, Ken. Good to see you.
And full disclaimer, I am in a virtual coffee shop, not a real coffee shop. It is the Red Truck Bakery in Marshall, Virginia, if you haven't been.
Cheers.
Well, thanks so much for being here. Look, I think there's so much ground for us to cover today, but I think it'd be great to kind of frame your experience and share our strength. Your mission is to end hunger and poverty. Tell us a little bit about just the history of Share Our Strength and what happens now as a result of the COVID pandemic, and is it changing anything that you're working on from a mission standpoint?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Ken, thanks for putting a spotlight on this issue. It's so important, and I'm sure this will be a huge help for what we do. We started Share Our Strength way back 35 years ago at the time of the Ethiopian famine, which was another catastrophic humanitarian event, limited just to one country, but that was the kind of the catalyst for us. And for many years, we were a grant maker to anti-hunger efforts around the world and in the US. But about 10 years ago, we got very focused on childhood hunger in the United States, feeling that that was a solvable problem. We listened to something that the writer Jonathan Kozol talks about, which is, he says, pick battles that are big enough to matter, but small enough to win. Yeah. And it felt like when it came to kids in the US who were hungry on a chronic basis, we could actually solve that problem. So we've been working to close the gap that exists in federally funded programs like school lunch and school breakfast. 22 million kids in the country get a free or reduced price school lunch. This is pre-COVID.
Sure.
Only 9 million were getting breakfast, even though all 22 million were eligible, and it was bought and paid for 22 million. So our job has been to go around and talk to governors, mayors, school superintendents, and say, here's what you need to do to get these kids enrolled. It makes a big difference, not just for their health, but their ability to learn, do well in school. And now, of course, with the COVID-19 crisis, all the schools are closed. 50 million public school students in this country are out of school. And so we've been engaged in this massive effort to replace those meals through all kinds of alternate feeding sites, some outside of school, some at Boys and Girls Clubs, some at YMCAs, food banks, that type of thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, we had to talk with John King, former Secretary of Education, CEO of Education Trust, and we did a real deep dive about just the inequity of the impact of COVID. And so much of the conversation wasn't even just about education and about learning, it was about access to food. I mean, and I think it's just shocking just how many young people in this country actually rely on the school system to kind of receive their meals.
Yeah, if there's any silver lining to come out of this at all, and I'm not sure there is, but one thing that I think will happen is that folks who really never appreciated the fact that so many kids depended on their school meals as their primary source of nutrition. This is something we've known, of course, for a long time, but now the general public's known that. In the early weeks of this, we saw an enormous spike in donors who had tuned into the fact that kids were really struggling. And as is always the case with children, they're not only vulnerable, but they're in many ways voiceless. You know, they don't vote. They don't
they're lobbyists. They don't have lobbyists.
They don't have lobbyists. They don't make campaign contributions. And so problems that should be actually pretty easy to solve are much harder to solve than they should be, just because the lack of political will.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So I wasn't even going to get into this, but as way of your background, you did come a little bit from a political background, right? So how do you view your role when you try to Share Our Strength, maybe different than other organizations, maybe taking some of that kind of campaign experience and some of your own kind of work into play?
It's a great question.
I don't know if you thought about it like that, but.
Well, it's a great question. I'd say I've really kind of come full circle, because when I first started Share Our Strength, I'd been chief of staff to Senator Bob Kerrey from Nebraska, and before that, Gary Hart from Colorado. Between the two of them, they ran for president unsuccessfully 3 times, which was my cue to find another line of business, being the principal architect of 3 losing presidential campaigns. But I did have a lot of those, I guess, for lack of a better term, community organizing skills or political organizing skills, and thought to put that to use for Share Our Strength. And what we found is that although there are many things I think nonprofit organizations like ours and others can do that perhaps government can't do. It's easier for us to take risks, to innovate,
Sure.
to be close to the people we serve and learn from it. But when it comes to scaling up a good idea, that takes public policy.
Yeah.
To really reach everybody that needs something like food assistance, you've got to have a role for public policy. And so in the early days of Share Strength, we were not that political. Today we are, although we're not at all partisan, but we are political in the sense that we do a lot of work to change public policy. Even in this COVID crisis, the first thing we had to do was get legislation into one of these first relief packages that said the law that says you can only give a school meal to a child had to be changed so that you could give it to their parent. The law that said you can only give a child one meal, that had to be changed so that you could give a parent 5 or 10 so they didn't have to come out of their house every day. So we dealt with a lot of that, and we found that advocacy, including things around the SNAP food stamp program, those become vital ways of really reaching people at the scale that the problem exists.
So let's dive into that, right? So a lot of these conversations we've been having are a bit focused on analyzing the response. And we have this $2 trillion relief package. We have, small business one that's, made it through the House last week, and obviously a lot of talk about what's coming down the pipe. What was in there that you liked, that you didn't like? What should the federal government be using its resources for as it relates to food insecurity?
Yeah. Well, we're an organization, we haven't even talked about this, but this from kind of your previous life. We're an organization that's deeply dependent on restaurants and chefs in the culinary community. They've always been at the core of Share Strength. And when we first started the organization, we thought that they would feel a connection to the issue of hunger since they made their livelihoods from feeding people. So in terms of these legislative relief packages, obviously very happy to see things like payroll protection and other types of small business assistance for these restaurants are in many ways anchors in their community and have been for a long time, and so philanthropic. They've always been there to help people that needed it, and now they need help. So we're glad to see that. We're glad to see a lot of waivers and loosening of restrictions that make it easier for us to feed kids when they're out of school. The big thing that we're pushing for now is an increase in the SNAP food stamp program so that families hopefully get a 15% increase. They're absorbing all the costs now of feeding their kids at home. Sometimes they're able to find these alternate sites, but in many cases they're going to have to do what we're all doing, which is scramble to, provide 3 meals a day when we're all living in one house, and we weren't always in the house 24/7. So we're hoping to see that, hoping to see an increase in the minimum amount that folks get from food stamps, which is $16. We'd like to see that to go to $30. So there's a lot the government could still do to make life, a lot more bearable for people who are suffering.
So I think that's the interesting aspect about SNAP, right? I mean, so much of what you've been doing has been focused on kids with No Kid Hungry, but SNAP's really for families, right? I mean, what is the family food hunger situation vis-a-vis the kid situation?
Yeah, well, that's really come to light in this crisis now because, and I'll give you a good example. We've always felt that kids are what people understand the most. There's tremendous amount of empathy towards kids who are hungry, but the best thing we can do for a lot of kids is find ways to support their parents and their families and strengthen them. That's not always as popular. It's not always as attractive politically, but one of the first things we noticed, even in the early days of schools providing alternate ways of feeding kids, if they're grab and go sites or families driving up, they're feeding everybody. And the schools are only going to get reimbursed for the meals that go to kids, but I think their attitude is we've got to feed everybody. Who's going to be able to sort out, once the family got home, which person ate what meal? It's kind of a ridiculous thing to even worry about at a time like this, and we've got to feed everybody. So families, are probably the most important thing we can try to strengthen right now.
And I think you've probably seen, obviously, more than I have, these visuals of just the lines at food banks around the country. I mean,
it's remarkable, and that's not a fun thing to do. I've never had to do it, but I've been to many of those lines to talk to people about what's going on in their lives, and that's something you only do when you're pretty desperate. You can imagine any of us having to make that decision. So this need's going to be with us for a long time. We've got now 26 million Americans, I think it is, who have filed for unemployment over just the last 5 weeks or so. So this, obviously, the financial crisis is going to last a lot longer than the health crisis. Hopefully the health crisis becomes manageable soon, but a lot of people are going to need help for a long time.
So what's interesting about your career, you create Share Our Strength, focused on Ethiopia and focused on drought and famine and just the inability to even get food. Now you're fighting in the United States, and millions of people have food insecurity, but there's plenty of food coming out of the ground in the United States. The New York Times had a big expose the other week about just the amount of eggs and dairy that are kind of either thrown away or dumped. Talk to us about that. I mean, it's not a problem in the United States of America that we don't have the food. We just can't get it to the people that need it.
So it's a really great point, and it calls up a couple things for me. So first of all, when we talk about this being a solvable problem, kids in our country aren't hungry for the reasons that kids around the rest of the world are hungry. You say it's not famine or drought or war, it's poverty. It's our lack of success in connecting kids to programs that are there to help them. But it's no shortage of food. And even in this COVID crisis, we've seen an enormous amount of attention paid to shortages in tests and in ventilators and in hospital beds. We don't have shortages of food. We're going to run into some challenges probably at some point with our food supply chain. And as you said, there's this mismatch now of farmers, dairy farmers having to pour out milk because cows, you have to keep milking cows, right? You can't put them on hold. Other crops being plowed under. That's going to be a role that I think only the federal government can solve. It requires, matching and playing an exchange and a matchmaker role that I think only the federal government could do. But fundamentally, this is a solvable problem. And one of the things that we've tried to help people understand is even though kids are poor, they don't have to be hungry. So I'll give you an example, Ken, of a school that I visited not too long ago. It was in actually Almonte, California. It's inland from LA, about 45 minutes. A pretty poor community, 7,500 kids in the school system, 2,500 of whom are homeless out of 7,500. Okay, about half of them are officially homeless, about half unofficially moving from place to place. A very high percentage of their families are undocumented and can't find great work. And I think 99% of them, whether they're homeless or undocumented, are at the poverty line. So this, in the past, would have been a prescription for a kind of a social determinant for these kids being hungry. They're not hungry. They're getting breakfast at school. They're getting lunch. There's an after-school program. So you have this really almost for the first time in history, this paradoxical situation of kids living with poverty, kids living with food insecurity, but at least they're not hungry. At least they have a chance of being healthy, of doing well in school, maybe breaking out of this cycle of poverty that they've been stuck in. So this is, as I say, this is a solvable piece of this issue.
So my first exposure to No Kid Hungry was in the, around 2012, 13, really about access to breakfast. So how come that's such a controversial topic? Why do you have to work so hard to kind of get breakfast offered at schools?
Yeah, you'd think it wouldn't be.
It was just one of these things where I was kind of like, I don't understand. Why is this something that I have to?
So here's what we found, and it's really been an interesting set of learnings. So I mentioned 22 million kids in the country get a free school lunch. They're all eligible for breakfast. At the time we started to focus on this 10 years ago, only 9 million of the 22 million were getting the breakfast. So we started to ask ourselves the same question, well, why is this? Now, lunch kids are already there, so it's easier to feed them. At breakfast, they have to get to school earlier. I think that might be a manageable problem, but it's not manageable for everybody. Some kids' parents' work schedule, sometimes the bus driver's schedule. There's the stigma attached to being the kids who go early for the free school meal. So we came up with this fix. And actually, I shouldn't say that. We didn't come up with it. We learned of some innovations that we realized we could play a role in scaling. And the innovation was moving breakfast from the cafeteria before school to first classroom, first period during school, or grab and go. Now, when you suggest that to schools, guess what happens? Everybody associated with the school system objects violently to the idea of feeding kids in school. Teachers are afraid of having to clean up spilled milk and a mess in the classroom, pests, rodents, taking away from instructional time, janitors not wanting to pick up the trash at a different time than their contract says they pick up the trash. Now, those are all manageable problems. We've overcome them. And I'll give you one really good example. One of the first years we did this in LA County, we said, let us do it in 30 schools to prove how successful it can be. We kind of flooded the zone with volunteers and others that could help. Teachers could go on teaching. Within 6 months, the superintendent of schools in LA mandated it that it go from 30 schools to 670 schools.
Wow.
It was so successful. So once folks try it, they never go back.
Good.
But again, there's a set of logistical issues around it, but the real political issue is, again, that kids are voiceless and somebody's got to be their lobbyist.
I mean, it's incredible through this whole thing, again, a silver lining. Like, we want these talks to be kind of positive. You know, obviously we're dealing with an incredibly difficult time and circumstances, but what can we learn from this and derive? And so much of what I keep running into in these conversations are just logistical issues, right? You know, whether it's, surplus equipment or food insecurity, and just kind of real practical opportunities for public policy solutions that should be things that we can come together and kind of solve, right?
Yeah, I kind of see our role as locksmiths, in the sense that every time a door closes and locks, it can be unlocked, but somebody's got to raise their hand and say, I'm going to do this. And when you think about, take schools for an example, they're dealing with so many of society's problems, right? They're dealing with, the issues that kids come to school with, some of the toxic stresses of poverty. They're dealing sometimes with family dysfunction. They're sometimes dealing with drugs or violence. So when we say, hey, we've got this idea about how to feed kids better, we're somewhere on a list of, 25 things that the school is dealing with. But the key to our job is, like, every time a barrier comes up, we've got to knock it down. And you just got to, you got to understand that that's what the job is. And I think there are many well-meaning people that propose an idea, and we've seen this even in our own sector. And at the first sign of an obstacle to it, they stopped, and we're like, no, we're going to knock that obstacle down.
Beautiful. So to talk a little bit about the organization in general, right? So you create Share Our Strength. No Kid Hungry is a subsidiary. What other things are you covering and working to address, and how are you organized internally, and then pick what you want to put your effort and energy behind?
Yeah. So No Kid Hungry by far is our main priority, and we really believe that we'll get to a point where there aren't kids in the United States who are hungry. There's other things we're looking at as well. We've got a great program called Cooking Matters, which is a nutrition education program for families and includes a lot of young moms. When you think about it, knowing how to, having the knowledge that many of us take for granted of what to do with food, how to purchase it, how to cook it. If you're on a fixed income, knowing that if you buy a chicken and can carve it up, that's cheaper than buying chicken parts. The Cooking Matters program does that. We've also got some international grants we're making. We're funding one of the largest school meals programs in the world in India right now, called Akshaya Patra. So we're doing work in other parts of the world as well. But we've been pretty determined to say, let's get this issue of childhood hunger off the table. Let's solve it once and for all.
That's amazing. So let's see real quick. So I love that you talked about restaurants, right? So you have long had these amazing restaurant partnerships and so on. I'm sure you're seeing this trend of restaurants kind of converting to grocery stores. I mean, how are your conversations going with restaurateurs, and kind of how they've even been innovative and made a pivot on some of their work?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because you and I know a number of the same folks in the restaurant industry. We were talking earlier about Mark Murphy before we came on here. A lot of amazing people, and I'd say restaurateurs are characterized by creativity, innovation. Many of them, to some degree, are artists in terms of their cooking, but they're also business people, so they've got to be both. So we're seeing restaurants do a number of different things now. We're seeing some of them, as you say, become grocery stores. We're also seeing a lot of restaurants that are now cooking for hungry kids and families, for first responders, for doctors and nurses. This is something that Jose Andres, the World Central Kitchen, is doing. Many of the chefs we work with have come to us, and they're doing their own local versions of that.
Yeah, Brian Noyes, the chef at Red Truck Bakery, I think has been going over to Nat Stadium with Jose Andres. Talk real quick about nutrition and food quality. I mean, how much of that plays a role in some of your efforts and work? Obviously, just addressing food insecurity and hunger is incredibly important, but how do you kind of weave in a commitment focused to nutrition and health and wellness?
Yeah, I think it's becoming increasingly important for a variety of reasons. It's the right thing to do, but also many of the chefs and the restaurateurs that we work with are really passionate about, healthier food and nutritious food, and a whole set of other issues having to do with farm to table and it's sustainable and so forth. So it's become very important. We are working on a couple of different levels. Our first line of attack has just been access, make sure kids have something to eat. But we're also working, for example, there's a great, relatively new organization called the Urban School Food Alliance. And they're using the buying power of the 12 largest school districts in the country to go to their vendors to say, we want healthier, better products for our kids. In the city of Boston, And you'll find this interesting as somebody who spent a lot of time in New York.
Hey.
In the city of Boston, up until a couple years ago, all of the school meals in Boston were cooked in Long Island and frozen and put on a truck and eventually thawed out somewhere in Boston, because Boston had a very the physical plant, the infrastructure is very old. They literally didn't have kitchens in Boston schools. So there's been efforts now. A company called Wayfair, Wayfair, the home furnishings company. Niraj Shah and his wife Jill Shah have created a thing called My Way Cafe, and they're actually building kitchens to do scratch cooking in public schools.
That's incredible. I want to flag for everybody right here on the right side in our chat. You can see the website for nokidhungry.org as well to learn more. You also have a podcast yourself, right? Add Passion and Stir, right? I listened to the Dan Barber one, so you're on these all the time, huh?
Well, this podcast has been a lot of fun for us. As you know, you get to talk to a lot of interesting people, and it stimulates a lot of good ideas. Our podcast, most weeks, again, pre-COVID, included a chef and somebody in the public policy world, because our food is tied to so many things that we care about. It's tied to our health, it's tied to our ability to learn, it's tied to our environment, tied to our use of our carbon footprint. So we try to make those connections and have that conversation. And Add Passion and Stir has been a weekly conversation. Dan Barber is somebody that I'd wanted to have on forever, and COVID unfortunately has made it easier to access people, because a lot of us are sitting in our homes and can actually spend time doing something like this. And Dan is just one of the most thoughtful people I know when it comes to food and its relationship to our culture.
Yeah, no, one of the things I found interesting in that conversation that I think goes for the entire restaurant industry and so many of your partners is the fact that how hard these restaurateurs and folks in this business work to build these teams and get together these incredible people, and obviously how dire it has been now with so many folks on furlough and just not kind of there, that are obviously dedicated, passionate, and have so many great ideas that hopefully are going to come out of this with some new direction for all of us. Really.
Yeah. Well, you'll remember on that podcast, Dan talked about how you work your whole life to get to be with a certain kind of successful, creative, talented group of people, and he used this image which has really stuck with me. I thought it was kind of haunting. He talked about the night they closed their restaurant. He had this dream that he was driving a long haul 18-wheeler truck, and everything that he possessed was in the back of the truck, flying out the back end. And he couldn't stop the truck, and that's what it felt like to him.
Yeah, that really stuck. Real quick before we let you go, obviously you're a data-driven organization. What can you tell us about the data you're collecting? Whether it's, I think you have a new effort where people can text to get access to food and so on. I mean, has this been an opportunity for you to gather more intelligence and information to use moving forward?
Yeah, it has. So we're data-driven in a couple of ways. One is we have a dashboard, and we're really meticulous about measuring things like the fact that we've added 3.2 million kids to the school breakfast program over the last 6 years. We know that number. We know how many per state. And then most recently, we created this kind of food finding text line. So families, if they text to 877-877 and text food, immediately it'll come up, in your zip code, in your neighborhood, where the places, the times, the dates that you can get free meals for your family now. And literally hundreds of thousands of people have availed themselves of that already.
Yeah. And how, I think I heard on a different podcast you were doing how you're working with school districts and bus drivers just to get PPE supplies too. I mean, like how this logistical issue is also kind of falling on you to kind of help coordinate and to address as well, huh?
Yeah, again, whatever the obstacle is to getting food to kids. So the food itself is there and it's paid for by the government, but you can imagine now school workers needing the PPE equipment and everything else. And so we're funding all that. I should mention that we've got a website, nokidhungry.org, that explains so many of the things that we're doing and ways that people can get involved, either by donating or writing to their members of Congress, that type of advocacy work.
Perfect. And if you're tuning in, you could just check on the right side in the chat function. The website is right there. So before we let you go, real quick, I noticed yesterday Tyson's Food has been raising a lot of attention. They had to close a couple of plants and kind of forecasting some potential challenges related to the meat supply. What are you seeing kind of behind the scenes in terms of supply chain and access to food, and what we should be thinking about over the next coming weeks and months?
Yeah, I think right now we're just seeing some early warning signals, and they were probably inevitable that companies who are working very hard to keep their supply chain clean and safe are starting to see some problems as the virus has spread. I think one of the things that we talked about earlier, which is the role of the federal government in playing a a matching role between the enormous need of, food banks and school districts and others. We're funding at the rate of about $1.5 million a week, and every week to hundreds of organizations that need food. And to think that there's other places that have it, we've got to get that matchmaking function fixed, and we've got to just watch the supply chain very carefully.
Interesting. All right, last question I was going to focus on was, we talked about restaurants, we talked about the big institutional folks like the Tysons. What about like the local smaller farms? So when you're thinking about, your farmers market and some of these local boutique farms, I mean, how are they dealing with it? What are you hearing from them? Are they involved in a lot of your efforts? I mean, obviously the restaurateurs, I think, tap so many of those farms, but
yeah, they are.
They're kind of in this gray area. That's going to get kind of.
Well, this is something, again, that I learned from Dan Barber by talking to him on our podcast, when he said, he's got some suppliers that he was so passionate about their products that he became their only customer. And now that his restaurants are closed, they have no business. It's really going to be hard. Like, the smaller farms are going to be more vulnerable to what's happening now, just like the smaller kids are more vulnerable in a different way. So it's going to be very tough for them. One of the things that we've tried to do is to make sure that things like the SNAP electronic benefit transfers are available to be used at farmers markets, that they can be used to support farmers in some of these smaller settings. Hopefully that makes some difference.
That's excellent. Well, look, not that there's a major, silver linings out of all this, but tell us, how many new donors have you seen come and support No Kid Hungry over this time?
Well, the generosity has really been astonishing to me. I've never seen it like it. We work, as you've said, with restaurateurs and with corporate partners. Individual donors have always been important, but not a huge factor in our organization. We've had 37,000 individual donors come in the last 6 weeks, and 5 to 6 weeks, and 92% of them are new and first-time donors. So it really speaks to people. And Ken, I've got to believe that a lot of them are worried about their own personal finances and their economic future, as we all are. So just really astonishing generosity, and I think inspiring.
And that's one of the things that we're trying to kind of, I think everyone needs to keep an eye on is, there's so many amazing nonprofits and organizations that usually receive a lot of support and commitment from people that today, because everyone's, either dealing with unemployment or insecurity or instability or uncertainty, may be tightening purse strings. So it's so reassuring to hear that. We're actually going to be having a talk on Friday, May 1st, this Friday, with Wes Moore, the CEO and president of Robin Hood Foundation. And then so much of what he and I have talked about are consistent with what you talked about today, where your role kind of in philanthropy is really to tear down these barriers and to take the risks and to kind of innovate in a new way.
Well, Wes is an amazing leader and somebody that we all are trying to learn from. I'm really glad you're going to be speaking with him.
He's the best. Well, look, Billy, I want to thank you so much for coming on Coffee with Ken. Always great to see you and then to talk about these important issues. I want to thank you for your time. And again, we look forward to seeing all of you on Friday this week with Wes Moore. So in the words of all of our dedicated leaders, stay home, stop the spread, save lives. Billy Shore, share our strength. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ken.
Have a great one. Take care.
Sure. Bye-bye.